The morning of June 19th, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Taiho, the newest and largest carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy's fleet. Around him, spread across 100 miles of the Philippine Sea, sailed 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. This was the mobile fleet, Japan's most powerful naval force, and Ozawa had committed it to what he believed would be the decisive battle of the Pacific War. 300 miles to the east, American carriers were supporting the invasion of Saipan. Ozawa's mission was to destroy them, to shatter American naval power in one climactic engagement, to turn the tide of a war that had been steadily, remorselessly turning against Japan. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He had reason for confidence. His aircraft had greater range than American planes. He could strike the American fleet while remaining beyond their reach. He could launch his strikes into the prevailing easterly winds, while the Americans would have to turn away from him to launch their own aircraft. His land-based aircraft from Guam and Tinian would coordinate with his carrier strikes, overwhelming American defenses with attacks from multiple directions. By noon, Ozawa would learn that every one of these assumptions was wrong. But the lesson that would truly shatter Japanese confidence came not from defeat itself, but from watching how the Americans fought, not individual acts of heroism, not tactical brilliance, but something far more devastating: the seamless, mechanical efficiency of an industrial power operating at a scale Japan could never match. The American carrier task force waiting for him comprised 15 carriers. 7 of them were Essex-class fleet carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons, each capable of operating up to 90 aircraft. They had been built in American shipyards in less than 2 years each, constructed with standardized components, assembly line techniques, mass production methods that Japan's strained industrial base could not replicate. These carriers formed Task Force 58 under Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher. They operated in 4 task groups, each built around multiple carriers, protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The formation stretched across miles of ocean, positioned to defend the invasion fleet at Saipan, while maintaining the flexibility to maneuver as a unified strike force. Commander Nakajima Tadashi, an observer aboard the battleship Yamato, had studied American carrier operations through intelligence reports, through analysis of previous battles, through examination of captured documents. He understood intellectually that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's, but understanding numbers on paper was different from witnessing the reality. At 9:30 in the morning, Ozawa launched his first strike. 69 aircraft, fighters and bombers climbing into formation, turning east toward the American fleet. Japanese carrier doctrine, refined over years of training and combat, emphasized the massed strike, multiple carriers launching simultaneously, aircraft forming into a single, coordinated attack group under a strike commander. At Pearl Harbor, at the Indian Ocean raids, at Coral Sea, this doctrine had proven devastatingly effective. The Americans detected the incoming strike on radar at 150 miles. This itself demonstrated a technological gap. American radar, improved continuously throughout the war, could track aircraft at ranges Japanese equipment could not match. But what happened next revealed something beyond technology. The American carriers did not scramble fighters piecemeal. They did not react with confusion. They executed a coordinated defense that had clearly been practiced, refined and standardized across the entire task force. Within minutes, 220 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters were in the air, not launching individually from 15 separate carriers, each making independent decisions, but positioned in layers at different altitudes, directed by fighter controllers aboard the carriers, coordinated through radio communication, forming a defensive screen that covered the entire task force. The Japanese strike encountered this screen 60 miles from the American fleet. What followed was slaughter. American pilots, trained for 18 to 24 months before entering combat, engaged Japanese pilots who had received as little as 3 months of training. The Hellcats, powered by 2,000 horsepower engines, protected by armor plate, equipped with 650 caliber machine guns, tore through the lighter, more fragile Japanese aircraft. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike, 42 were shot down before reaching the American fleet. The remaining 27 pressed through the fighter screen and faced the second line of defense, anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and their escorts. American ships carried the VT proximity fuse, a top-secret device that caused anti-aircraft shells to explode near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits. The shells created lethal clouds of shrapnel that Japanese pilots had never encountered before. 16 more aircraft fell to anti-aircraft fire. 11 bombers reached attack positions. They released their weapons against the carriers and achieved no hits. The entire strike force, 69 aircraft, produced 0 damage to American ships. 25 planes returned to their carriers. 44 were lost. Ozawa, not yet understanding the scale of the disaster, launched his second strike at 10:56, 109 aircraft, then a third strike at noon, 47 aircraft, then a fourth at 11, 82 aircraft. Each wave encountered the same coordinated defense. Each was decimated by Hellcats, directed by radar controllers, cut down by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, overwhelmed by defensive systems the Japanese could neither match nor counter. By early afternoon, Ozawa had launched 373 aircraft. American pilots, in reports filed after the battle, described the Japanese attacks as uncoordinated, poorly executed, like shooting sitting ducks. One pilot from the carrier Lexington remarked that it reminded him of turkey shoots back home. The nickname stuck. The battle would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but while American pilots celebrated their victory, Japanese observers were confronting something more disturbing than tactical defeat. They were watching the American carriers continue to operate with mechanical precision, even under attack, launching aircraft, recovering aircraft, maintaining formation, coordinating defense, all while sustaining combat operations at a tempo Japan could not match. Captain Omai Toshikazu, a staff officer with detailed knowledge of carrier operations, watched through binoculars from a heavy cruiser as American fighters swarmed his attack aircraft. What troubled him was not the individual combat, it was the system behind it. How many fighters had the Americans launched? How had they positioned them so quickly? How were they being directed to intercept with such precision? Japanese carriers, operating 4 or 5 together, could launch a massed strike of over 100 aircraft in rapid succession. 7 minutes to spot and launch, 15 minutes to form up, then proceed to target. This capability had given Japan dominance in the early war, but the Americans weren't launching massed strikes. They were maintaining continuous air operations, launching and recovering aircraft throughout the day, keeping defensive patrols airborne, rotating fresh pilots into combat, operating at a sustained tempo rather than in single massive pulses. The American carriers didn't need to launch everything at once because they had enough carriers, enough aircraft, enough pilots, enough fuel to maintain operations indefinitely. And they were doing this while simultaneously defending against Japanese attacks, while supporting ground operations at Saipan, while coordinating across 4 separate task groups spread over miles of ocean. At 1:10 in the afternoon, submarine USS Albacore fired torpedoes at Ozawa's flagship, Taiho. 1 torpedo struck. The damage initially appeared manageable, but ruptured aviation fuel lines released fumes throughout the ship. 3 hours later, a spark ignited the fumes. The massive explosion broke Taiho's back. She sank at 3:32, taking down 1,600 men. At 1:20, submarine USS Kavala torpedoed the carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier battle of the war. Multiple explosions followed the torpedo hits as aviation fuel and ammunition detonated. Shokaku sank at 3 o'clock. 1,200 men lost. The Americans hadn't even needed their carrier aircraft to sink 2 of Ozawa's largest carriers. Their submarines, positioned by intelligence that had detected and tracked the Japanese fleet, had achieved what their air power had been unable to do. Another demonstration of coordinated, systematic warfare. By nightfall on the 19th, the score was devastating. Japan had lost over 300 carrier aircraft and 2 fleet carriers. The Americans had lost 29 aircraft in combat, no ships damaged. Ozawa withdrew west, believing his aircraft had damaged American carriers and forced them to retire. The Americans hadn't retired. They had been preparing to pursue. But Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, had made a controversial decision. His primary mission was to protect the Saipan invasion. He would not risk pursuing Ozawa too aggressively and potentially leaving the invasion fleet exposed. So Task Force 58 maintained position through the night, letting Ozawa's battered fleet escape. On the morning of June 20th, American reconnaissance aircraft finally located Ozawa's retreating fleet. The range was extreme, 275 miles to the west, near the maximum combat radius of American carrier aircraft. Launching a strike at this distance meant aircraft would return after dark, and night carrier landings were dangerous even for experienced pilots. Admiral Mitchell made the decision: launch everything. At 4:21 in the afternoon, 216 aircraft lifted from American carrier decks, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, all heading west into the late afternoon sun, knowing they faced not just combat, but the harrowing prospect of finding their carriers in darkness with fuel gauges reading empty. Aboard the heavy cruiser Atago, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita watched the American strike inbound on radar. His staff officers gathered around the plotting table, counting the contacts. Over 200 aircraft. From how many carriers? A staff officer checked the morning reconnaissance reports. American task force had been positioned 70 miles to the east. That meant the strike had launched from maximum range. The Americans were pushing their operational limits to pursue. Kurita turned to his operations officer. How long to launch our remaining aircraft for defense? The officer hesitated. Sir, we have perhaps 70 aircraft operational across all carriers. Fuel is limited. Many are damaged from this morning's landings. We can launch perhaps 40. 40 fighters against 200 attackers. The mathematics were brutal. But what struck Kurita more profoundly was the comparison. The Americans had lost nearly 30 aircraft yesterday, had launched over 200 today, and presumably still retained reserves. The Japanese had launched over 300 yesterday, lost most of them, and now could barely muster 40. The American strike arrived at 6:40. What Japanese fighters managed to intercept fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed. American dive bombers plunged through clouds, searching for carriers through broken overcast. Some found the carrier Hio. Bomb hits and torpedo strikes left her burning. She would sink that night. Others hit tankers, destroyers, damaged the carrier Zuikaku. The Americans lost 20 aircraft to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Then came the return flight. 200 aircraft, some damaged, all low on fuel, flying east through gathering darkness toward carriers they could not see. Mitchell made another decision that would define the battle. Light the fleet. Every carrier, every escort ship turned on their lights. Searchlights pointed straight up like beacons. Flashlights, truck lights, anything that could guide pilots home. It violated every blackout protocol, made the fleet visible to submarines, risked attack. But Mitchell chose to save his pilots. Aircraft began arriving around 8:30. Pilots, exhausted and flying on fumes, attempted to land on darkened flight decks, lit only by dim guide lights. Some made it. Some crashed on deck. Some ditched in the ocean near the fleet, hoping destroyers would find them. Some simply ran out of fuel and went into the water in darkness. 80 aircraft were lost in the recovery, but destroyers rescued most of the pilots, and by morning, only 16 pilots and 33 aircrew were missing. Commander Nakajima aboard Yamato received reports throughout the night. The Americans had lit their entire fleet to recover aircraft. They had risked submarine attack to save pilots. They had lost 80 aircraft in the recovery, but considered it an acceptable price because the pilots survived. This was a fundamentally different calculation than Japanese doctrine, which treated aircraft and pilots as expendable in pursuit of tactical success. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the days following the battle, as both fleets withdrew and the full scope of losses became clear, Japanese naval staff officers struggled to comprehend what had happened. The numbers were catastrophic. Japan had lost over 400 carrier aircraft and 3 fleet carriers. Critically, they had lost over 400 trained pilots and aircrew. The Americans had lost 123 aircraft and 76 pilots. But Captain Omae, writing his assessment for Naval Headquarters, focused on something beyond the loss ratio. He tried to articulate what he had observed about American carrier operations. They maintain continuous operations where we launch single strikes. They coordinate defense across multiple task groups while we defend individual carriers. They recover and rearm aircraft while under attack, where we must suspend operations during combat. They treat pilots as valuable assets to be preserved, where we accept their loss as necessary. His report continued with observations that troubled him more deeply. The Americans launched this strike from maximum range, knowing recovery would be difficult, and chose to illuminate their fleet to save pilots. This demonstrates both operational flexibility we lack and industrial confidence we cannot match. They can afford to lose 80 aircraft in recovery because they can replace them. We cannot replace our losses from yesterday. More critically, they can train replacement pilots faster than we lose them. We cannot. At Imperial Navy Headquarters in Tokyo, staff officers examined the battle reports with growing alarm. The loss of carrier aircraft was severe but theoretically replaceable. Japan's aircraft industry, though strained, could produce replacements within months, but replacing the pilots was impossible. The training pipeline that had produced the superb carrier pilots of 1941 and 42 had been designed for peacetime, not for wartime attrition. A carrier pilot required 18 to 24 months of training. Japan no longer had 18 months. The Americans, by contrast, had expanded their training programs to industrial scale. Flight schools across the United States produced thousands of pilots annually. Training carriers in Lake Michigan, far from combat, gave pilots hundreds of practice carrier landings before they deployed to the Pacific. By mid-1944, American carrier pilots entering combat had more flight hours than Japanese veterans who had fought since Pearl Harbor. This disparity in training showed in combat performance. At the Philippine Sea, American pilots achieved kill ratios of 15 to 1, 20 to 1, even higher in some engagements. It wasn't just superior aircraft, though the Hellcat was indeed better than the Zero. It was superior training meeting inferior training, experienced pilots fighting novices, a system designed to produce quality meeting, a system collapsing under pressure. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, writing his private assessment weeks after the battle, noted that American carriers had maintained air operations throughout 2 days of combat without apparent degradation. Our carriers launch a strike and must recover before launching again. The Americans launch strikes, maintain defensive patrols, conduct reconnaissance, and recover aircraft simultaneously. This requires coordination, communication, and crew training that exceeds our capabilities. He continued with an observation that cut to the heart of Japan's strategic problem. A single American Essex-class carrier operates 90 aircraft. 15 carriers operated over 1,300 aircraft at Philippine Sea. Our entire carrier force operated fewer than 500. But the critical difference is not numbers. It is that when they lose aircraft and pilots, they replace them within weeks. When we lose them, they are gone forever. We are mining a finite resource while they operate from an inexhaustible supply. The battle demonstrated something Japanese planners had feared but hoped to avoid. American industrial capacity had reached a scale that Japanese military power could not contest. The carriers themselves illustrated this. Japan had built Taiho, their newest fleet carrier, over 3 years in a single specialized shipyard. The Americans were building Essex-class carriers in multiple shipyards simultaneously, completing them in 15 to 18 months using standardized components and mass production techniques. By June 1944, America had commissioned 13 Essex-class carriers, with more under construction. Japan had completed Taiho, which had just sunk, and no comparable carriers were near completion. The industrial mathematics were impossible. For every carrier Japan built, America built 5. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 10. Captain Omai's report reached the desk of Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet. Toyoda read it carefully, then met with his staff. The implications were clear. The Philippine Sea had not been a tactical defeat that better execution might remedy. It had been a demonstration that American military capacity now exceeded Japan's ability to contest it through conventional means. One staff officer suggested that improved tactics might close the gap. Better coordination between carrier strikes and land-based aircraft, more aggressive pursuit of damaged American carriers, preserving carriers for decisive battle rather than risking them in attritional engagements. Toyoda listened, then spoke quietly. The Americans brought 15 carriers to this battle and lost none. We brought 9 and lost 3. They launched over 1,300 aircraft and lost 123. We launched 473 and lost over 400. Better tactics will not remedy this disparity. Another officer suggested focusing on defending the remaining defensive perimeter, concentrate forces, choose favorable terrain, make every American advance costly. Toyoda shook his head. The Americans demonstrated at Philippine Sea that they can project overwhelming force wherever they choose. They can maintain that force indefinitely. They can replace losses faster than they sustain them. We cannot contest this through defensive concentration. The mathematics are against us. The room fell silent. Finally, Toyoda spoke again. What we witnessed at Philippine Sea was not merely a naval battle. It was a demonstration of industrial warfare at a scale we cannot match. The Americans have built a military machine that operates continuously, replaces losses automatically, and improves constantly. We're fighting with finite resources against an opponent with effectively infinite capacity. This realization spread through the upper ranks of Japanese Naval Command in the weeks following the battle. In private conversations, in classified reports, in staff assessments, the same conclusion emerged repeatedly. The war, as Japan had conceived it, as a series of decisive battles that would break American will, was unwinnable. America's industrial base had produced not just more ships and planes, but an entire system of warfare that Japan could not counter. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and studied American carrier operations extensively, wrote a private assessment that reached Admiral Toyoda. He described watching American task forces operate during the Marianas campaign. They maintained continuous combat operations for weeks. Carriers launched strikes while simultaneously recovering aircraft, refueling, rearming, and defending against attack. Damaged ships withdraw to mobile repair facilities that can restore combat capability without returning to port. Supply ships deliver fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts at sea, allowing task forces to remain operational indefinitely. He contrasted this with Japanese operations. Our carriers launched strikes in pulses, requiring time between operations to rearm and refuel. Our damaged ships must return to Japan for repairs. Our logistics require periodic returns to base for resupply. The Americans have created a self-sustaining combat force that can operate at the limit of its range for months. We cannot match this even at our most efficient. The fundamental difference, Fuchida noted, was not tactical, but systemic. The Americans had designed their fleet for sustained operations at industrial scale. Everything from carrier design to crew training to logistics support assumed continuous operations, high attrition, and constant replacement. Japan had designed its fleet for decisive battle, assuming superior training and tactical skill would offset numerical inferiority. That assumption was now proven false. The Essex-class carriers embodied this American approach. Each carrier required a crew of over 2,000, operated 90 aircraft, consumed vast quantities of fuel and ammunition, and demanded constant maintenance. But American shipyards had built over a dozen of them in under 3 years, and American training programs had produced the crews to operate them, and American logistics had sustained them in continuous combat across the Pacific. Japanese observers noted details that illustrated the scale. American carriers carried enough aviation fuel to operate continuously for 10 days of combat. Japanese carriers typically carried enough for 3 to 4 days. American carriers had redundant systems, multiple fire mains, sophisticated damage control equipment that allowed them to survive bomb and torpedo hits that would sink Japanese carriers. American fleet oilers could refuel multiple carriers simultaneously at sea, while Japanese logistics required carriers to return to base more frequently. These weren't individual advantages that clever tactics might overcome. They were systemic capabilities built into every aspect of American naval design and operations, and behind them stood an industrial base producing steel, aluminum, fuel, ammunition, and trained personnel at rates Japan could never approach. By late June 1944, senior Japanese naval officers understood that the Philippine Sea had marked a turning point, not because it was a particularly large battle by later standards, but because it had demonstrated so clearly that American naval power had reached overwhelming superiority. The Americans could now bring more carriers, more aircraft, better pilots, more advanced technology, and superior logistics to any engagement. Admiral Ozawa, who had survived the sinking of Taiho, wrote in his official report that the fundamental problem was not tactical execution, but material inferiority. The Americans possess technological and numerical advantages that nullify our advantages in training and experience. Their radar allows early detection we cannot match. Their proximity fuses make anti-aircraft fire far more effective. Their superior pilot training has eroded our historical advantage. Most critically, their ability to replace losses means attrition favors them while it destroys us. The carrier Zuikaku, sole survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, now represented the entire operational carrier force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Other carriers existed, but they lacked aircraft, lacked trained pilots, lacked fuel to operate. Zuikaku herself operated with a scratch air group of partially trained pilots and obsolescent aircraft. She would survive until October, when American carrier aircraft would sink her at Leyte Gulf. In the final analysis, what Japanese admirals said when they realized the full capability of American carrier operations was less important than what they understood. They had witnessed industrial warfare at a scale their nation could not match. They had seen a military machine that could sustain losses they found crippling while continuing operations they found impossible. Captain Omai, in a letter written after the war, reflected on the Philippine Sea. We knew intellectually that American industrial capacity exceeded ours, but knowing numbers is different from witnessing the reality. Watching 15 American carriers operate continuously for 2 days, launching over 2,000 sorties, maintaining perfect coordination, replacing losses overnight. It was like watching a force from a different era of warfare. We were fighting with the tools and tactics of the early war. They were fighting with an industrial system we could not comprehend, let alone counter. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not end Japanese naval resistance. Ships would fight on, submarines would continue to operate, desperate tactics like kamikaze attacks would emerge. But the battle ended any possibility that Japan could contest American naval superiority through conventional means. The Americans had demonstrated not just superior numbers, but superior systems, and behind those systems stood an industrial capacity that dwarfed Japan's entire military economy. The title that suggests Japanese admirals couldn't believe one carrier launched 90 planes in 7 minutes is, in a sense, correct in spirit, if not literal fact. What they truly couldn't believe, what shattered their confidence more than any single tactical demonstration, was witnessing 15 carriers launch over 400 aircraft in coordinated strikes, maintain continuous combat operations for 2 days, lose over 200 aircraft and barely pause in their operations, and do all of this while defending against Japanese attacks and supporting ground operations simultaneously. The weeks following the Philippine Sea brought a cascade of reports to Tokyo that painted an increasingly grim picture. Intelligence officers compiled assessments of American carrier capabilities based on observation, captured documents, and analysis of the battle. What emerged was a portrait of naval power operating at a scale that Japanese planners had considered theoretically impossible. A detailed analysis, prepared by the Naval General Staff, examined American carrier operations hour by hour during the battle. The report noted that Task Force 58 had maintained continuous air operations for 48 hours. During that period, they had launched over 2,000 individual sorties, fighter patrols, strike missions, reconnaissance flights, anti-submarine patrols, all conducted simultaneously across 15 carriers operating as a coordinated unit. The report's author, a commander who had served as an observer in the United States before the war, added context that made the numbers more disturbing. Each sortie requires aircraft preparation, pilot briefing, deck spotting, launch, recovery, refueling, rearming, and maintenance. A carrier operating at maximum efficiency might launch and recover 60 sorties per day. Task Force 58 averaged over 1,000 sorties per day across 2 days. This represents not individual carrier efficiency, but systematic coordination at fleet level. He continued with calculations that illustrated the industrial implications. To maintain this operational tempo requires approximately 1,000 tons of aviation fuel per day, 10,000 gallons of lubricating oil, 500 tons of munitions, and continuous spare parts supply. This entire logistics requirement was met by fleet oilers and ammunition ships that accompanied the task force, allowing continuous operations without returning to base. We possess no comparable logistics capability. Japanese carriers, by contrast, typically operated for 3 to 4 days before requiring resupply at a forward base. The difference wasn't merely operational efficiency. It reflected fundamental design philosophy. American carriers were designed as mobile air bases that could sustain themselves at sea indefinitely. Japanese carriers were designed as strike platforms that operated from shore bases, conducting raids and returning for resupply. This design philosophy extended to every aspect of carrier operations. American carriers had larger aviation fuel storage, more extensive magazines, better damage control systems, and more comprehensive repair facilities. But, more critically, they operated within a fleet train of support vessels that could provide everything from fuel to replacement aircraft at sea. Task Force 58 included not just the 15 carriers and their escorts, but 35 tankers, ammunition ships, supply vessels, and repair ships. These logistics vessels allowed the combat ships to remain at sea for months. The entire task force operated as a mobile naval base, self-sufficient and sustainable. Japan had no equivalent logistics capability. The concept of sustained operations hundreds of miles from shore bases, supplied entirely by sea, conducting combat operations continuously for weeks, represented a form of naval warfare that Japanese doctrine had never emphasized. Partly, this reflected geographic reality. Japan fought close to its island bases and assumed logistics could flow through those bases, but it also reflected industrial limitation. Japan lacked the merchant shipping, the tankers, the specialized support vessels to create a mobile fleet train on American scale. Commander Nakajima, now assigned to analyze the battle's implications, wrote a report that examined the technological gaps exposed at Philippine Sea. American radar superiority allowed detection at ranges exceeding 100 miles, giving hours of warning before attacks arrived. American radio communication coordinated defense across multiple carriers, allowing fighters from several carriers to form integrated defensive screens. American proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells multiplied effectiveness of defensive fire by factors of 3 to 5 compared to time-fused shells. Each technological advantage individually was significant. Combined, they created a defensive system that Japanese attack doctrine could not penetrate. Nakajima noted that Japanese doctrine assumed strikes could overwhelm defenses through concentrated attack and superior pilot skill. At Philippine Sea, American radar negated surprise, American radio coordination negated concentration, American technology negated pilot skill, and American numbers made attrition unsustainable. His report included a section on pilot training that revealed the deepest structural problem. Before the war, Japanese naval aviation maintained approximately 3,500 carrier-qualified pilots. These pilots received 18 to 24 months of training and were considered the finest naval aviators in the world. By June 1944, fewer than 300 of these pre-war pilots survived. The remainder had been killed in combat or consumed by the attrition of 2.5 years of warfare. Replacement pilots now received 3 to 6 months of training before deployment. They flew aircraft inferior to their opponents, received inadequate gunnery training, lacked experience in formation flying, and had minimal combat preparation. At Philippine Sea, these poorly trained pilots flew against American pilots who averaged over 2 years of training, flew superior aircraft, and benefited from combat experience gained in earlier battles. The result was predictable. Kill ratios at Philippine Sea exceeded 15 to 1 in America's favor. Japanese pilots weren't merely outfought, they were overwhelmed by opponents who possessed every advantage in training, technology, tactics, and numbers. Nakajima's report concluded with a section titled Sustainability Analysis that examined long-term implications. The Americans lost 76 pilots at Philippine Sea. Their training pipeline produces approximately 500 carrier-qualified pilots per month. They will replace June's losses within 1 week. We lost over 400 pilots. Our training pipeline produces approximately 50 carrier-qualified pilots per month, and quality continues to decline. We will require 8 months to replace June's losses, and replacements will be inferior to those lost. He added a final observation that crystallized the strategic impossibility Japan faced. American pilot training occurs in the continental United States, secure from attack, supplied by domestic industry, utilizing dedicated training carriers and hundreds of training aircraft. Our training occurs in Japan, subject to increasing air attack, supplied by diminishing industrial output, utilizing operational carriers needed for combat. The Americans can expand their training program indefinitely. We struggle to maintain our current inadequate pipeline. This was the reality Japanese naval leadership confronted in summer 1944. The Philippine Sea had not merely defeated one fleet in one battle, it had revealed that American military power now operated at such scale that Japanese resistance, however determined, could only delay the inevitable. Admiral Toyoda, reviewing assessments from his staff, understood that no tactical innovation or strategic repositioning could remedy the disparity. Japan's remaining carriers lacked aircraft and pilots. Its pilot training program could not replace losses. Its industrial base could not produce modern aircraft in sufficient numbers. Its logistics could not sustain operations at the tempo Americans maintained routinely. In September 1944, the Naval General Staff produced a classified assessment titled Future Operational Capabilities of the Combined Fleet. The document was brutally honest. Carrier aviation capability has been destroyed. Remaining carriers lack trained pilots and modern aircraft. Rebuilding capability would require 12 to 18 months under ideal conditions. Current conditions are not ideal. American air attacks on Japanese industry, fuel shortages, and loss of training bases make rebuilding impossible. The assessment recommended abandoning conventional naval operations and adopting desperate measures. Kamikazes, suicide attacks using partially trained pilots flying obsolescent aircraft loaded with explosives, would emerge from this strategic bankruptcy. If pilots cannot be trained to survive combat, the reasoning went, train them only to die, effectively. But even this desperate measure could not alter the fundamental imbalance. By late 1944, American carrier task forces operated with impunity across the Western Pacific. Task Force 38, the redesignated carrier force under Admiral Halsey, struck targets from the Philippines to Formosa to Okinawa. Japanese forces could harass these strikes, could inflict occasional damage, but could not prevent them or effectively counter them. The scale of American operations continued to expand. By October 1944, during the Leyte Gulf Campaign, American carriers launched over 2,900 sorties in a single day. The logistics required to sustain such operations, the coordination required to execute them, the industrial base required to supply them, all exceeded anything Japan had achieved even at the height of its power. Captain Omai, observing these operations from shore bases, wrote in his private journal about the psychological impact of watching American carrier strikes. "It is not the individual attacks that demoralize. It is the relentlessness. They strike today. We endure it. We repair what damage we can. They strike tomorrow and the next day, and the day after. Never stopping, never pausing, never giving us time to recover." This is what industrial warfare means. The enemy has industrialized violence itself. His observation captured what Japanese forces experienced throughout the final year of the war. American military power had reached a scale where it could maintain continuous pressure across multiple theaters simultaneously. Carriers struck Japan while other carriers supported operations in the Philippines, while still other carriers trained in American waters preparing to join the fleet. This multiplicity of force was beyond Japanese capability. Japan's entire remaining carrier force in October 1944 consisted of 4 operational carriers with scratch air groups. The Americans had over 20 fleet and light carriers operating in the Pacific, plus dozens more in training or transit. The mathematical disparity had become absurd. At Leyte Gulf in October, Japan committed its remaining carrier force as a decoy, deliberately sacrificing 4 carriers to draw American carriers away from the invasion fleet. The plan relied on American commanders taking the bait. They did, but it didn't matter. Even with the main carrier force pursuing Japanese decoy carriers, enough American naval power remained to destroy the Japanese surface force attacking the invasion fleet. The carrier Zuikaku, last survivor of Pearl Harbor, sank at Leyte Gulf after absorbing multiple bomb and torpedo hits. With her went the last vestige of Japanese carrier power. Other carriers survived, but lacked aircraft, fuel, or pilots to operate. They would spend the rest of the war as floating targets, eventually sunk at their moorings by American carrier strikes. In the final analysis, what Japanese admirals couldn't believe about American carrier operations wasn't any single capability. It was the totality of American naval power operating as a system. 15 carriers working as one fleet, continuous operations sustained by mobile logistics, pilot losses replaced within weeks. Damaged ships repaired at sea or at forward bases, new carriers arriving every month, better aircraft entering service continuously, improved tactics evolving through experience. Every element of this system exceeded Japanese capability. But more than that, the system as a whole represented a form of warfare that Japan's military culture and industrial base could never replicate. The Americans had industrialized naval warfare, applying mass production techniques, standardization, continuous improvement, and scale to military operations. Commander Fuchida, writing after the war, reflected on this transformation. "We trained for decisive battle, assuming superior skill would offset inferior numbers. The Americans prepared for industrial war, assuming sufficient scale would overwhelm any opponent." At Pearl Harbor, our assumption held. By Philippine Sea, theirs had proven correct. We were fighting the wrong kind of war with the wrong kind of military for the opponent we faced. The carrier operations that so impressed and dismayed Japanese observers were merely the most visible manifestation of a deeper reality. American society, with its industrial base, its educational system, its technological innovation, its resource wealth, had created military power at a scale that Japan's militarized society, despite fanatical determination and tactical skill, could not contest. The specific claim that Japanese admirals watched one carrier launch 90 planes in 7 minutes may be apocryphal. But the truth was more devastating than any single demonstration. They watched 15 carriers launch over 400 planes in coordinated strikes. They watched continuous operations sustained for days without pause. They watched losses replaced, damage repaired, and capabilities expanded month after month. What they truly couldn't believe, what shattered the confidence built over years of victory, was confronting the reality that Japan had challenged an opponent whose military potential was only beginning to be realized. Every month of the war saw more American carriers commissioned, more pilots trained, more aircraft produced, more technology improved. The trend was inexorable, and its conclusion inevitable. Admiral Toyoda, in his private papers, discovered after the war, wrote about the moment he understood Japan had lost. It was not Midway, though that battle turned the tide. It was not the Philippine Sea, though that battle destroyed our carrier aviation. It was seeing American task forces operate continuously across the Pacific, striking wherever they chose, sustaining operations indefinitely, growing stronger while we grew weaker. That was when I understood we were not fighting a war we could win through courage or tactics. We were fighting industrial capacity itself, and that battle had been lost before the first shot was fired. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated this truth with brutal clarity, not through any single remarkable feat, but through the sustained, systematic application of overwhelming force. Japanese admirals didn't need to witness impossible demonstrations of carrier capability. What they witnessed was far more demoralizing. The routine, efficient operation of naval power at a scale they could observe, could understand, but could never match. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.